morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to the session here. I'm Professor John Trougakos from the University of Toronto, along with one of my colleagues. We have conducted a preliminary study examining some of the negative effects of avoidance-focused coping on job outcomes, specifically job performance. But as you'll see, there's a little bit more to the presentation than just an examination of avoidance-focused coping. In general, employees have to deal with many work demands, and people deal with demands throughout many phases of their life, work being a very substantial time of our life that we spend a lot of time with. We have a lot of demands during the job. It is a substantial type of stress that it produces for us. There are many aspects of our work life that can blend over to our personal lives, and so having ways to deal with the multiple demands that we face on the job are important. And as we know, there are some ways that are more effective than other ways in coping with the demands that we face in our daily activities, and in particular in the workplace. In this particular study, we are going to focus on two types of strategies that people use to cope with their work demands. One is psychological detachment, and the other one is avoidance-focused coping. And when I say avoidance-focused coping, what I'm talking about are sort of more maladaptive avoidance strategies. Psychological detachment, basically it's the mental switching off from work. This comes out of the work recovery literature, which examines the way in which people recover from the daily demands of their job. It looks at such things as how people use work breaks, after work time, weekends, vacations, etc. According to this literature, if people can mentally detach from work when they are on break or away from work, this reduces the stress and strain, allows them to recover depleted personal resources that they have, and as a result, also allows them then to be less stressed at work, have greater resources available to be able to interact effectively with their coworkers, and also provides them with greater resources available to be able to, in theory, perform their job more effectively. Overall, what this literature suggests is that when people can psychologically detach from work, that is, they're making a choice to disengage from work. They're not trying to run away from problems or anything like this. They're just deciding to use time away from work basically to recover, to take downtime, to do something else, not demanding on them in the same way that work is. When they are able to detach from work, what the literature suggests is that they have more effective outcomes. They are more energized, they're less stressed, and they should be able to perform better. But interestingly, there have been some mixed findings when it comes to detachment in the recovery literature. Basically, that often it's typically predicted that the outcomes will be beneficial, but oftentimes there are null results that are found. So there are quite a few positive findings as well. We do see better performance outcomes with detachment. Typically, we do see reduced stress with detachment, but some of the studies have not proven the predictions consistently. But in general, what the literature does say is that psychological detachment from work, especially when you're at time away from work, is psychologically beneficial and has beneficial outcomes for employees in general. On the other hand, when people are using avoidance coping styles, in essence, they're avoiding, denying, or withdrawing from people or situations. And in terms of the workplace, this would mean they're avoiding work problems, sort of denying that issues exist, avoiding dealing with performance issues or difficult coworkers or conflicts that might arise in the workplace. And in these situations, the underlying problem persists, is not reduced in any way or alleviated. Therefore, the strain, the stress that is associated with that doesn't actually disappear. And of course, when the employee has to face these problems at work, inevitably as they must, they oftentimes make the problems worse, or at least stay the same, and they have the same strain and stress associated with it. They're not really doing anything constructive in this case to prevent to deal with the problems or deal with the strains that they might have. The literature shows that this kind of coping can negatively impact interpersonal relationships for a variety of reasons. and that inevitably, especially in the workplace, if you're avoiding problems that are associated with your job, you really aren't dealing with them, there's going to take a toll on performance in theory after a while. There's not a substantial amount of literature in the organizational literature, not a substantial amount of research in the organizational literature examining this type of coping and performance on the job especially. So this is kind of a preliminary study, a preliminary examination into some of these processes and these relationships. Now, what's interesting is if we consider detachment and avoidance, both methods of coping seem similar in a sense. You know, you're removing yourself from the situation at hand. You know, you're removing yourself from the work issue, whatever it might be. But recent research does indicate that even though they seem similar, there are clear differences between them. Detachment tends to be more constructive and used to take a beneficial break from work. It's not that people are trying to avoid work or avoid work issues or whatever it might be. They're actually making the choice to be engaged with the break or non-work time that they actually have. And so the theory is that this will be beneficial to them because they're not having ruminative processes continuing. There's not underlying issues that they're seeking to avoid. They're just deciding to be fully immersed in the time away from work that they happen to have and not continue to let the stress that people have every day, you know, to think about whatever might bother us on our job. That doesn't continue on when we engage in detachment. Avoidance, on the other hand, tends to involve less effective strategies that often still have people thinking about the issues. The issues are underlying what they're trying to avoid basically are still there. The stress still persists, and as a result, it is a less effective way to disengage yourself from your work demands. In the current research, what we look at, and this is an initial kind of study of a larger research program that a colleague of mine are in the midst of, is that we're focusing on work stress, the stress that employees feel on the job. We're looking at workplace relationships, specifically focused on leader-member exchange relationships. That is the quality of the relationship between an employee and their supervisor. Large body of evidence over the last 4 decades suggests that this is an especially important relationship in the workplace, impacts numerous quality of work outcomes for the employee and success outcomes for the employees. And so this relationship is especially important from the perspective of the employee. And finally, we're also going to look at job performance and see, do these different coping strategies differentially impact the effectiveness of the employee on the job? So our hypotheses are quite straightforward. In terms of psychological detachment, we expect a negative relationship between detachment and work stress. That is, if you are detaching from work in an effective way, not avoiding problems per se, but using your time off of work to not think about work, not stress yourself over work, not trouble yourself over the demands that are there but you can't do anything about at the time, then you should experience overall less work stress. In terms of the quality of leader-member exchange relationship, because detachment allows us to recover energy, it replenishes our resources, it provides us with greater recovery from work and the demands that work faces. In theory, when employees are on the job, they should be more energized, they should be more capable of effectively engaging socially with their colleagues and with their supervisors. As a result, what we expect is that there should be a positive relationship between detachment and the quality of relationships that employees form with their supervisors in the workplace. The final psychological detachment hypothesis is that, taking this into account, if employees are more energized, they are in a better psychological state, that inevitably what this should lead to is more effective performance. That by being able to more effectively recover from work when they can detach successfully outside of work, this should allow them to subsequently on the job be more effective, perform better, and overall be more successful employees. So we would expect that detachment will be positively related to job performance. in terms of the relationship with these outcomes with avoidance-focused coping, because people who are engaging in avoidance-focused coping, in essence, are running away from problems or the demands or the stresses that they have without dealing with them, they're actively seeking to be sort of in denial or withdraw from them in a way that is maybe not constructive. This will not alleviate the stress that the demands might place on the employee. And as a result, if we consider, for example, the job demands, job control theory, what it suggests is that when we have continual demands on us over time, inevitably, without dealing with them, that stress, that strain persists. So we expect that avoidance-focused coping will be positively related to work stress. That is, the greater the use of avoidance-focused coping, the greater levels of stress employees should experience subsequently in their job. Second hypothesis, because this type of coping, because avoidance prevents people from dealing with issues, issues can linger, it takes a toll on someone, it allows ruminative thought to persist, we expect that this will have a negative impact on social relationships. And indeed, the literature does show that this type of coping does typically relate to lower quality of social relationships. In particular, in the workplace, especially with a supervisor who has a higher power differential than the employee, if problems persist and are not dealt with, the problems become magnified. It becomes harder for the employee to interact and deal with that supervisor. The negative experiences or states that the employee might be in that they're trying to avoid don't get fixed, and it can negatively impact the way their supervisor views them and the quality of relationship and the level of communication that they have as a result with their supervisor. And this will lead to a lower quality of exchange relationship that they have with their supervisor. So we expect that there will be a negative relationship between avoidance coping and leader-member exchange. Finally, we expect there to be also a negative relationship between avoidance-focused coping and job performance. And this is in many ways attributable to the fact that they don't really get fully away from the demands that they're facing in work, right? Because they're kind of avoiding, they linger, they're thinking about it. They're not dealing also with work problems. So by avoiding the problems that cause them discomfort, that cause them issues, they're not actually dealing with the problems. And over time, this can be not only a one-off issue that they avoid and spirals into a bigger problem, but really can be an accumulation of issues that inevitably really leads to their lack of success in being able to be effective and perform on the job. So we expect a negative relationship between avoidance, coping, and job performance. What were our methods for this study? Now again, this is just a preliminary study we have as part of a larger program of research, but we have data from a multi-way field study of a large policing organization in North America. Our final sample in this case was about 267. At time one, we had the focal participants complete measures assessing their coping styles. At time two, we had participants complete measures assessing their level of stress. And so the time gap between these two periods was about 3 months. Right, so time one, 3 months later, we had them evaluate for us their work stress. 3 months later, we also had supervisors complete a measure of the quality of exchange relationship they had with the focal employee. And we had co-workers who worked closely with them, who saw them on a daily basis and could observe their performance, provide measures of job performance about the focal employee. Now, this is important because this design is separated in time. Although it can't totally address issues of causality, at least it helps to reduce some of these issues because we have broken our measures off over time. The other thing it does is we have multiple sources here, so the threat of common method, same source bias is somewhat reduced here. People aren't evaluating themselves. We have outside people doing the evaluation of some of these outcome variables. So what were our results? Our detachment hypothesis, the only one that was supported was stress. So basically, there was a negative relationship between detachment and work stress at 3 months later, as reported by the employee. And this is in keeping with what we expected, that, of course, being able to mentally detach in a constructive way from work will reduce your stress and strain levels on the job over time. Interestingly, but almost not surprisingly, consider, as I said at the beginning, that there are these mixed results when it comes to the recovery literature on detachment. In terms of performance and quality of exchange with the supervisor, there was not a supported significant relationship there. So hypothesis 1B and 1C, unfortunately, were not supported. If we look at our avoidance hypotheses, what we see is that each hypothesis is supported as we would have predicted. So employee reports of using avoidance coping was positively related to stress 3 months later on the job. So if they generally reported that they used avoidance coping, when we measured their stress 3 months later, they reported having higher levels of stress. Also, their supervisors subsequently reported, people who were higher on avoidance coping, that they had a lower quality exchange relationship with the supervisor. They had a less effective relationship with their boss, basically. And in addition to this, what we find is that there's also a negative relationship with job performance, as evaluated by a coworker. So people who use greater levels of avoidance coping on the job, we also found that subsequently their performance was rated less effective by their coworkers. So the pattern of results that we expected in terms of avoidance coping are consistent with what we expected, are consistent with what we have actually found here. And between the two types of coping, we do see some difference. As we would expect, there is, one detachment does seem to be a more effective way of at least dealing with stress, but whereas avoidance definitely doesn't seem to fit that pattern. So if we were to have a few quick conclusions here at the end, research is just, in terms of the organizational literature, has started to disentangle some of these different types of coping mechanisms. It's from work psychology perspective, there is less work so far done on coping. We've done a lot of work on emotion regulation. There's been a growing body of research in the domain of work recovery. We've had some stuff on coping, focus a lot of times with work-family crossover and so on and so forth. But in particular, comparing different types of coping strategies on the job as they relate to work outcomes is somewhat sort of a under-researched topic in the organizational literature. So being able to not only look at the differences between detachment and avoidance coping in the future will be fruitful, but also moving forward, generally looking at the role of different coping mechanisms in the workplace should also provide interesting insights. We see that avoidance-focused coping is related to a few important workplace outcomes. Again, there's not that much research specifically on avoidance and job performance and these kind of things. So this does provide some insight. And we know that people do regularly use these types of coping strategies that we know not to be super effective. And unfortunately, in a way, organizations don't really pay attention to these kind of things when it comes to how employees deal with their work problems. So maybe bringing a greater awareness to organizations about these different types of ways that employees might be more effective in the job and the different types of coping strategies they can use could be fruitful for not only researchers but practical purposes for organizations as well. Detachment findings are consistent with past work. We do typically see a detachment is related to lower levels of stress, and somewhat mixed findings in terms of other types of outcomes. And once again, in this study, we see similar results as well here. Now, the analysis that we conducted, again, this is a preliminary study. We used an M+ model, which is basically a path model analysis. And again, relatively straightforward research. This is kind of a preliminary study, but the results support what has previously been found and partially what we would expect. In terms of future work in this, my colleague and I are doing some work examining the specific processes, the mediating and moderating processes that are involved with the different types of coping strategies and work outcomes, to gain a more rich and in-depth insight as to how these impact employees, what are some mitigating factors or exacerbating factors, that might help or hinder employees in the workplace, and to give us a better understanding of what the steps and processes that are unfolding in terms of different coping strategies and the way in which that employees function effectively and function in general in the workplace. I believe that is the end of my presentation for today. Thank you very much. Are we taking questions now, or are we waiting till the end?